Sandra sat in stunned silence, David's words still ringing in her ears. She had come into this conversation uncertain, shaken by the weight of opposition, but now, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Conviction. She looked at David, the man who had just spoken wisdom so deep, so compelling, that every doubt in her heart had been dismantled. Slowly, she exhaled. "David, there's something I never told you." David leaned in, his expression gentle. "What is it?" She hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Before you came to propose to me, I had a dream. A dream that, at the time, I didn't fully understand." David's eyes narrowed in curiosity. "What did you see?" Sandra drew a deep breath, recalling the details as vividly as if she had just woken up from it. "I saw myself following you everywhere you went, not because I was forced to, but because I wanted to. And as I walked with you, I noticed a group of sisters from the church standing at a distance, watching us with anger and resentment." David's brows furrowed, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "Then suddenly, 3 of them stepped forward and began mocking me. They said I should leave you alone. That you belonged to them. That I was standing in the way of God's plan for their lives." David's jaw tightened. Sandra swallowed hard. "I told them they were mistaken. That one man could not be God's will for all 3 of them. But they wouldn't listen. They just kept saying it wasn't my problem, that I should step aside and let them have you." She paused, her fingers tightening in her lap. "Then, they attacked me. Physically. They grabbed me, pulled me, fought me, but I refused to let go. I fought back. And no matter how hard they tried, they did not prevail." Sandra's voice softened. "Then I woke up." David sat still, absorbing her words. After a moment, he asked quietly, "Why didn't you tell me about this dream before?" Sandra sighed. "Because at the time, I thought it was my own battle. I prayed about it, asked God for strength, and moved on. I didn't think it was something you needed to worry about." David studied her, a slow understanding dawning in his eyes. "Sandra, that dream was a warning. A glimpse of the battle ahead. It wasn't just about those 3 sisters. It was about every force that would try to separate us." Sandra nodded, realization settling over her. David reached for her hands, holding them firmly in his. "And just like in the dream, they will not prevail." Tears welled up in Sandra's eyes, not of sorrow, but of assurance. At that moment, she knew. No matter how fierce the opposition, no matter how hard the battle, she would stand. With David. And with God. The battle is not yet over, but Sandra and David have chosen to fight together. What challenges will they face next? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. David stood up, ready to leave, but before he could take a step, Sandra suddenly grabbed his hand again, her eyes wide with realization. "David, wait," she exclaimed. "I just remembered another dream." David turned back to her, intrigued. "What is it?" Sandra took a deep breath, her voice filled with urgency. "I found myself in the middle of a turbulent river inside a small boat. The storm was fierce, the waves were high, and I was the only passenger." David's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Go on." "The person steering the boat was dressed in a white garment, but I never saw his face. The storm kept raging, and I was terrified, but he spoke to me in a calm, steady voice. He told me to cleave to him, to hold on tightly and never be afraid, never look back." Sandra swallowed, lost in the memory. For what felt like an eternity, the storm continued, but he never let go. He kept rowing, guiding the boat safely until we reached the riverbank. And just when I was about to thank him, he vanished. She turned to David, her voice barely above a whisper. "David, what do you think that means?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smiled. A warm, knowing smile. One that told her she already knew the answer. Sandra's lips parted slightly as understanding washed over her. "There are still battles ahead," David said softly. "But victory is certain, because the Lord is involved." A slow, peaceful breath escaped Sandra's lips. Yes. She knew it now. No matter how fierce the storm. No matter how long the journey. God himself was in the boat. And with that, David gave her hand a final squeeze. Without another word, they both turned and walked their separate ways, not apart, but stronger than ever. For the first time since the battle began, Sandra's heart was completely at rest. Sandra threw her hands in the air as she stared at the final result on her laptop screen. First-class honors. Tears welled up in her eyes. The battle had been long and painful, but God had been faithful. David was the first person she called. I made it, David. I finished well, she said, her voice shaking with joy. David chuckled on the other end. I never doubted you for a second, Sandra. Her heart swelled with gratitude. Through everything, the rejection, the betrayal, the heartbreak, David had never left her side. Sandra was posted to a prestigious research institute for her National Youth Service Corps, NYSC. It was a place where she not only gained valuable experience but also earned a very good salary. With her income, she did something unexpected. She began assisting David financially. David had always been there for her, encouraging her, guiding her. Now, it was her turn to support him. One evening, as they walked through a quiet street after church, Sandra turned to David with a determined look in her eyes. David, she said, I've been thinking, why don't we start a small business together? David looked at her, surprised. A business? Yes, she nodded. Something profitable, something we can grow. I have some savings, and I want to invest in our future. David smiled, admiration shining in his eyes. You're incredible, Sandra. You always think ahead. And with that, they started their first business together. The business started small, but it thrived. Sandra's financial support, coupled with David's business acumen, made them a formidable team. A year later, David graduated with top honors and immediately joined Sandra in expanding their business. Their profits doubled. Then tripled. Within months, they became the envy of many, both within their family circle and in the church. The same people who mocked them, who dismissed them, who tried to separate them, now whispered in amazement. How did they succeed despite everything? Wasn't their relationship supposed to fail? Even Sandra's parents, who once despised David, could not ignore his success. In hushed conversations, they admitted to each other. Maybe we were wrong about him. Meanwhile, in the church, whispers of regret spread among the marriage committee members. They had tried to stop what God had already blessed. And now? David and Sandra were rising before their very eyes. David and Sandra sat outside a quiet cafe after their weekly business meeting, discussing plans for expansion. The evening breeze was cool, and for once, life felt peaceful. Just as Sandra was about to suggest a new investment strategy, a familiar voice interrupted. Brother David, Sister Sandra, can I have a word with you? They turned to see Brother Clement, one of the more notorious brothers in the church. Known for his cunning nature and ability to gather sensitive information, Martins had a reputation for being everywhere and knowing everything. David and Sandra exchanged glances. Something about Clement, tone felt different. David motioned to an empty seat. Go ahead, Brother Clement, what's on your mind? Clement exhaled deeply and leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. There's something I've been holding back for too long. Something that might finally make sense of everything you've been through. Sandra raised a brow. We're listening. Clement glanced around, as if ensuring no one was watching, then spoke. The general pastor wanted you for his daughter, David. David's breath hitched. Sandra stiffened. What? Clement nodded gravely. Long before you proposed to Sandra, the general pastor had already decided that you would marry his only daughter. He admired your spirituality, your intelligence, and your reputation. He saw you as the perfect son-in-law, a man who would bring prestige to his family. David felt his throat go dry. That doesn't make sense. Oh, it makes perfect sense, Clement countered. That's why the battle against you was so fierce. The moment you chose Sandra, you ruined the general pastor's plans. And he wasn't going to let that slide easily. Sandra's hands balled into fists. Clement continued, his voice now dripping with intensity. That's why the marriage committee attacked you. That's why the church threatened you with excommunication. It was never about spiritual guidance. It was about power. It was about control. David's mind raced. He had always respected the general pastor. Could it be possible that behind his spiritual facade, he had been orchestrating his own matchmaking agenda? Sandra spoke, her voice laced with disbelief. But, if the pastor had such plans, why didn't he just approach David directly? Clement smirked. Because he knew David would never agree. So, he let the committee do the dirty work. They were just puppets, enforcing an agenda disguised as spiritual authority. David swallowed hard. Sandra sat still, her heart hammering. Clement wasn't done. And that's not even the worst part. David and Sandra turned to him sharply. Clement exhaled again. Another brother in the church, a so-called friend of mine, came to me privately months ago. He begged me to keep an eye on Sister Sandra. Sandra narrowed her eyes. Keep an eye on me? For what? Clement leaned back. He said I should make sure no one approached you until he finished his studies and became financially stable. He believed you were his future wife. Sandra's mouth fell open. What? David clenched his fists. Who? Clement hesitated, then sighed. Brother Felix. Sandra's eyes widened. Felix. A quiet, deeply respected brother in the church. He had always been kind, polite, distant. David scoffed. But that doesn't even make sense. A man has to approach a woman, not claim her in absentia. Clement smirked. Oh, I know. But some brothers think spiritual entitlement is the same as divine leading. Felix believed you were his wife because, according to him, God told him so. Sandra's stomach churned. David exhaled sharply. And you're saying that because of this ridiculous claim, Felix actively discouraged other brothers from approaching Sandra? Martins nodded. Not just discouraged, he became one of the loudest voices against your relationship. He called you rebels, David. He said you were out of order, defying church authority. All because you dared to claim what he thought belonged to him. Sandra's mind raced. The aggression Felix had shown, the way he suddenly turned against them when their relationship became public, it all made perfect sense now. David, too, was connecting the dots. Clement continued, his voice lowering. And if that's not enough, do you want to know how many sisters in the church secretly told me they were waiting for you, Brother David? David's eyes narrowed. Clement chuckled darkly. 3. 3 different sisters confided in me that they had prayed, fasted, and were waiting for you to notice them. Sandra sucked in a sharp breath. Clement shook his head. So, you see. You and Sandra were never just fighting your families. You weren't just fighting the church committee. You were fighting unseen expectations, secret claims, and hidden desires that people refused to voice out. David ran a hand through his hair, his pulse pounding. Sandra's chest rose and fell in deep breaths. David, it all makes sense now. Every strange opposition. Every unexplained battle. This wasn't just about us. It was about people who thought they had a say in our destiny. David leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them, looking straight at Clement. Why are you telling us all this now? Clement exhaled. Because I've watched you two suffer for too long. I figured, if anyone deserves to know the truth, it's you. David nodded slowly. Well, thank you for the honesty. Clement shrugged. Don't mention it. He rose to his feet, nodded once, and walked away, leaving David and Sandra stunned, shaken, and speechless. They sat in silence for several minutes. Then, slowly, Sandra reached for David's hand. Man sees the outward appearance, she murmured, but only God knows their heart. David nodded, his voice firm despite the turmoil within. And that's why, no matter what they planned, God's purpose for us still stood. Sandra inhaled deeply. But what do we do now? David exhaled and squeezed her hand gently. We keep moving forward. Now that we know the truth, we won't let their schemes shake us again. Sandra nodded, more determined than ever. If they had survived this much already, they were not about to back down now. Not today. Not ever. David and Sandra sat across from each other in their usual quiet spot at the cafe, their fingers intertwined on the table. The weight of recent revelations still lingered between them, but tonight, there was a different kind of silence, the silence of decision. Sandra exhaled deeply. David, I've prayed. I've searched my heart. And I just know, we can't stay in that church anymore. David looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had been thinking the same thing, yet hearing Sandra say it out loud made it real. He sighed. I know. If we stay any longer, something even more sinister could happen. Sandra nodded. The things Martin's told us. The general pastor's hidden agenda. The secret claims people had over our lives. It's too much. That place isn't a church anymore, it's a battlefield. David ran a hand through his hair. And what's worse? It's not even about God anymore. It's about power, control, and personal interests. And I refuse to be a pawn in someone else's game. Sandra's eyes softened. So, we leave. David met her gaze. Yes. We leave. They sat in silence, processing the weight of their decision. Then Sandra spoke again. But David, I think we should go to different churches for now. David's brows furrowed. Why? Sandra sighed. Because, if we join the same church right now, people will start talking again. They'll say we left just to be together. And honestly, I need a space where I can grow in peace. I don't want to walk into another congregation and immediately be David's fiancée. I want to be just Sandra, for a while. David studied her. She was right. Once beaten, twice shy. They had underestimated how much human desires and manipulations could shape a supposed place of worship. They couldn't afford to make the same mistake again. David nodded slowly. I understand. We'll go our separate ways, for now. But once we're married, we'll decide together where to settle. Sandra smiled softly. Yes. That way, we can truly start afresh, without baggage or expectations. David reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Sandra, no matter where we worship in the meantime, one thing is certain, we're still standing. And we're standing together. Sandra blinked away tears and nodded. Yes, David. Together. And with that, they made the hardest yet most freeing decision of their lives. They walked away from the place that tried to destroy them. Not in bitterness. Not in fear. But in the confidence that God was leading them somewhere greater. David and Sandra have finally broken free. But what lies ahead in their separate journeys? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. At Sandra's family home, the atmosphere was heavy with anger and disapproval. The air seemed to vibrate with her father's fury, a fury that had only deepened since he discovered her defiance. In his hand, he clutched a freshly delivered letter from Chief Martins. The envelope, crisp and official, carried a message Sandra's father could not let pass. Sandra, her father bellowed in the parlor, his eyes burning with indignation. You've disobeyed me for the last time. This letter from Chief Martins is an order. He demands you present yourself at his house, with an application letter for one of his companies. And don't you dare say you're not interested in a job, because if you continue like this, you'll end up in poverty. I'll curse you if you refuse. Sandra's heart pounded as she clutched the letter to her chest. In a trembling yet resolute voice, she replied, Father, you know I'm not looking for a job. I have a business, one that I run with David. We're building our future together. Her father's face reddened with rage. A business? That won't put food on the table. You'll learn soon enough that if you don't do as you're told, poverty will be your fate.
Now, go quickly to Mr. Martin's house and honor his invitation. I won't have you stubbornly wasting your time on foolish pursuits. Later that evening, still reeling from the confrontation, Sandra sought solace in the one person who had been her steadfast rock, David. They met in a quiet corner of their favorite park, away from prying eyes and harsh judgments. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Sandra confided, "David, something's come up. My father has handed me a letter from Chief Martin's. He insists I go to Martin's house with an application letter for one of his companies." David's eyes narrowed with concern. "But Sandra, you've told me time and again that you're not interested in a job. You're building our business, our future. Why would they suddenly demand this?" Sandra's voice wavered slightly as she continued, "My father thinks I need a real job to avoid dying in poverty. He won't listen to reason. He shouted that if I don't honor Martin's invitation, he'll curse me. I'm caught between my own dreams and his threats." David reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "Sandra, we need to give him the benefit of the doubt. There might be more behind this invitation than meets the eye. Chief Martins has been involved in many church matters, and his motivations may not be entirely pure. Perhaps he's angling for something, maybe even trying to position himself as a potential suitor." Sandra's eyes widened as the implication sank in. "You mean he might have designs on me? As in, he sees me as a wife for his own agenda?" David nodded, his expression firm yet compassionate. "Yes, that's a possibility we cannot ignore. And I've heard whispers from those who claim that he may have even hoped you'd be the one for him. But Sandra, you must be clear. When you speak with him, tell him you are engaged to me. Make sure he knows that your heart and future already belong elsewhere." Sandra hesitated, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. But what if his reaction shows that he wasn't after me? What if there's a genuine business opportunity hidden in all this? David smiled reassuringly. "Then we'll consider it. But if he has any inkling of trying to force his own designs upon you, you need to set that boundary immediately. Your dignity, your dreams, none of that should be compromised by someone who sees you as a prize to be claimed." Taking a deep breath, Sandra met David's steady gaze. "I understand. I'll go to Chief Martin's house. I'll explain myself clearly, and I'll let him know that I'm engaged. I won't allow anyone to rewrite my destiny." David's eyes shone with both pride and determination. "That's the spirit, Sandra. Stand strong and let your truth be known. You have worked so hard for what we've built. Don't let anyone, not even a powerful man like Martin's, dictate your worth. Remember, we've overcome so much already, and we will face this too. Trust that God sees our hearts, and He will guide us." Sandra nodded, feeling the familiar surge of courage that David always managed to ignite within her. Though her heart trembled at the thought of confronting yet another force determined to control her life, she knew that with David by her side, even if only in spirit, at that moment she could stand her ground. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the city, Sandra prepared herself to leave for Chief Martin's house. Her resolve was firm. No matter what hidden agendas lay beneath this invitation, she would not be cowed. With her engagement clearly in mind and her future with David shining bright in her heart, she stepped forward into the uncertain night, ready to claim her destiny.